Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone here with us in person today at the Naturkunde Museum in Berlin, as well as our many online attendees to today's panel session. This is the Berlin Science Week panel discussion on evaluating researchers, ambitions, and realities. And this event is jointly organized by the Quest Center for Responsible Research at the Berlin Institute of Health, the Berlin University Alliance, and the Einstein Foundation of Berlin. My name is Jess Roman. I'm going to be the moderator of our panel here today. I'm an epidemiologist by training, working as a researcher at the Charité and the BIH. So I'm also personally interested in these discussion topics today, and I think many of you here in our audience are also very interested, and we're eager to hear your voices today throughout our discussion. Before I introduce our panelists, we'd like to learn a little bit more about you. So if you could fill in the poll today, you can join using this Slido QR code you see up on our slides here. We'd like to hear where you're from. Let's see if that's working. And also later on, through the same QR code, you can access a function to leave questions for our panelists. So hopefully we can get your voices heard that way today. Is that working for everybody? Great. Also online, of course, we'd be happy to hear where you're tuning in from and what specific career stage, what your position is, if you're listening to us today. Okay, so while you're responding to the poll, just to give you a quick organization of the next hour together, we don't have a lot of time and we're going to cram in a lot of important discussion here today. We're going to start with 2 5-minute inputs from the speakers next to me, and then I'll invite the rest of our panelists up to join the conversation in 2 waves, and we'll focus that discussion on 2 specific topics. I'll give short introductions when I bring up our speakers and panelists, but you can read more about them on the little bio sketch sheet that you found at your places today, and there's also a glossary of some terms and abbreviations that you might encounter in the context of research assessment. If you're tuning in online, you'll find those online on the web page as well. So feel free to have a look. Okay, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Elisabeth Gadd, and she chairs the International Network of Research Management Society, INORMS, Research Evaluation Group, and is a vice chair of the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, CoARA. I think she is the perfect person to give us her perspectives on the progress of research assessment reform efforts thus far. Thanks so much for joining us, Elisabeth.
Thank you so much.
First we'll show these poll results.
Oops. Okay.
Will those come up?
Oh, sorry. Should I go back?
No, that's fine. We can also show them after. Oh, wonderful. So they already came. And let's see then if we can get Elisabeth's slides up on the screen.
Whilst they're coming up, shall I kick off? I know we're short of time.
Perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you for the lovely introduction and the invitation to be here. I've been given 5 minutes to answer 9 questions, so you can see whilst I'm keen to get going. So first question is, why do we need a reform of the current research assessment system? And in a nutshell, I think the answer is that the current one is not giving us the right answers and is doing significant damage to the research ecosystem. So by relying on a narrow, often publication-based set of indicators and rankings, that are a very poor proxy for the very diverse range of skills and contributions and qualities that we need from the research workforce, we are rewarding a very homogeneous set of researchers, research topics, and research institutions, and incentivizing questionable research practices by doing so, incentivizing closed rather than open science, and this whole process of quantifying our scholars is having a significantly negative impact on their mental health, which is leading many to leave academia altogether. And of course, this is entirely unacceptable, and we need to address this as a matter of urgency. So the primary goals of the reform are, not surprisingly, to address those very problems I've just outlined. And CoARA, the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, summarises them in this way: to recognise a broader diversity of contributions, to prize qualitative forms of assessment supportive limited by quantitative indicators, to avoid the inappropriate use of publication-based indicators, and to avoid the use of university rankings in research assessment. And I think most in the broader assessment reform movement would agree with those commitments. And in terms of, what are the key drivers, I think this is where the reform movement is really interesting, in that the drivers come from all across the community, from universities themselves, from funders, individual researchers, young researchers, established researchers, university rectors, from open science advocates, from research integrity and advocates, from gender and other forms of equity advocates. Assessment reform is at the root of all of these really big, important sector-wide agendas that we care about, and we can't address those big agendas without first addressing what we recognise and reward in our research staff. In terms of what's been helpful and unhelpful, I'm just going to focus on one issue given the time, and that is that it's been really helpful to get such significant traction and buy-in from such a wide range of players across the ecosystem, but also a wide range of nations globally. So DORA and CoARA have signatories from around the world. The Global Research Council have now just agreed a set of dimensions on which assessment reform should happen. China, Korea, India, the US, all have institutions that have withdrawn from the university rankings. Assessment reform is on the global agenda, and that is great. But there is a potential risk here, certainly given the geopolitical situation that we're all in, that whilst we all broadly agree on the problem, that we don't all agree on the solution or solutions, i.e. what does good actually look like and how might we more successfully assess it. And that might affect the global mobility of researchers if different qualities are assessed and prized and rewarded in different parts of the world, and there is a risk that that might fracture the ecosystem. In terms of next steps, I think what the community really needs now is evidence of the efficacy of alternative approaches to research assessment. Many different groups are experimenting with narrative CVs, career assessment matrices. We've got NORCAM and FinCam. We've got new promotion pathways in many institutions. We've got randomization in grant allocation, which is great. And I think that to convince the wider community, we need evidence of the value of different approaches and the long-term impact they will have. Of course, this is a long game, and we need to give ourselves the time to experiment, the freedom to fail, and the time to evaluate our evaluations. We also need to manage expectations. There is no such thing as a perfect evaluation, but there are definitely better forms of research evaluation. And in terms of stakeholders, I think the key stakeholders are those with the resource to allocate, so be that jobs, promotions, funding or prizes, and changing what's valued by those resource holders is what will have the most impact on the system. And finally, I've been offered one wish, and if I had that one wish granted, I would seek international agreement on better ways to assess universities that render global university rankings obsolete. And this is because, whilst we often focus our assessment reform initiatives on researcher-level assessment, we forget that the reason many universities use poor publication-based measures to assess individual researchers is that those universities are assessed on the same measures by the rankings, which the governments then use to hold those universities to account. And even countries that claim they don't care about them are still affected by them. And I think I'm running out of time, so I can't kind of highlight the Draghi report on European competitiveness, which does actually use university rankings to draw conclusions about European performance. But I would say that just as we need to find alternatives to journal impact factors and H indices, we also need to find alternatives to global university rankings if we are going to reform assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. Let's give her a round of applause. I think this sets the stage quite nicely, and Elisabeth mentioned stakeholders, and she mentioned universities and how universities are measured, and who better to hear some input from than the Dean of the Charité, Professor Joachim Spranger, we're very happy to have you here with us today. You've been the Dean of the Charité since 2023, but you've been a professor at the Charité since 2008, I believe, and you've served not only as a scientist, researcher, and instructor, but also in various faculty committees over the years before becoming dean. So you have insights personally, professionally into these processes. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jess. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Actually, I remember just one question I had, but I may remember wrong. And the question was, what are we doing at the Charité to implement measures to improve quality, to improve robustness of research? And perhaps I can say a few words on the Charité. Charité is a medical faculty of Humboldt-Universität and Free University of Berlin. We have about 5,000 researchers. In total, we have about 23,000 employees. And we have the patient care side, and then, of course, we have the research. And in terms of research, perhaps I can use some historical matrices. We have a third-party funding. Let me start with the state institutional funding, which is about 270 million euro per year. And we have a third-party funding per year of around 300 million euros. We publish about 6,000 publications per year, and nobody loves rankings, included me, and we usually are doing quite well in the rankings. So from these perspectives, you might say, well, Charité is doing quite well, but if you ask me what is the impact of what we are doing, what really are we changing patient care, are we changing society? The true answer is I do not exactly know, because the evaluation criteria or the assessment criteria we have do not really reflect that. And we have the privilege really that we have an own institute, the Quest Institute of the BIH, which is investigating these questions very carefully. And perhaps I would like to mention that if we talk about quality and robustness of research, this is not only about the assessment. Apparently, that's a much broader, much more aspects which are really important for that. And at Charité, we really try hard to implement such measures. And perhaps I start with 2 or 3 structural measures. One we did, for example, for clinical studies. Clinical studies should be registered before you start them. And a few years ago, we had a registration rate that was about 30%. And then we made at that time, I was not responsible, but the dean decided together with the Quest that we have a structural measure which said, if you want to perform a study at the Charité, you have to register it. And now we have a registration rate of 100%. That has nothing to do with assessment or anything, but this is an important measure really to improve the quality. Same in preclinical research, animal research, for example. We know from many studies that the preclinical reproducibility of preclinical studies is very limited. And we're just working quite hard, and I think with some success, to improve that by rewarding the reproducibility of preclinical studies by using so-called Wildlinge. These are animals living in the normal environment, physiological environment, and instead of an artificial environment. And I think this is important really to have a much better quality of the preclinical research. Open science is, of course, an extremely important topic, and perhaps that is already important for assessment. I think it's important that we really differ for assessment between research of institutions and individual research. And we had, I think for 2 or 3 years, a so-called open data LOM, so we handed out some resources depending whether the researchers published open data. And to be honest, our impression was that the effect of this measure was very limited, although it's recommended, but the effect was very limited. And I think if you want to change that, probably it's better to have a very clear rule, a structural rule, which says if you want to publish at Charité, you have to make the data open. And that probably has much more effect rather than rewarding the individual researcher. So one last point, perhaps, which we think is extremely important apart from structures, is attitude of our researchers. I think we need a very early training of our researchers. Quest is doing particularly well in that, is really doing a lot of training, and we're just discussing a graduate center where we want to integrate the courses of the Quest to start very early, even with our students in our study courses, to get the right attitude, to get the right approach to research, to improve the understanding of our research, why it's important to have, at the end of the day, a high-quality research and high impact of what we're doing. So coming back to assessment, it doesn't mean assessment is not important. We think it's extremely important. Currently at Charité, we have an assessment which is still based on RCR, not impact factor. It's based on third-party funding. So we understand this is not perfect. We have a lot of ideas. We would like to integrate innovation, patents, quality of clinical studies. We certainly think patient involvement might be something which could be a marker of good quality of studies. So there are many ideas. We are working on that. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion here, because I would also like to learn what is really the best way to do it at the end of the day. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. Okay, so maybe now I can come back to those polls, just so we see all together who is here. So if we could get that poll about the career stage, perhaps, of our listeners. So actually most classified themselves as other. We have about, 1/5 PhD students, the same amount of postdocs, a few professors with us, and I'm assuming that other consists of a lot of administrators, science managers, and so on, so welcome. And do we also have the geographical poll? We may come back to that. Okay. No, that's fine. Okay, so before we get to specific questions and comments to our two input speakers, I'd like to extend the discussion by bringing up a few additional panelists to the stage. And after they each get an introductory question, we will engage in some panel discussion. If you do have questions along the way for any of our panelists, you can write them in the Slido poll. There should be a Q&A tab where you can put those questions, otherwise save them to the end, and we'll come around with a microphone for that. So next, please help me welcome to the stage, all at once, we have Dr. Tamarinde, Professor Julian Polte, and Professor Elisabeth Herrmann. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you.
Okay. So just as a matter of introduction, I will start with a welcoming question, and then we can discuss with and among each other. This one goes to Tamarinde. Welcome. You're an assistant professor in the Dutch academic system, which has already undergone a lot of these substantial research assessment changes that were described by Elisabeth earlier on today. And I wonder, as a recent member of the faculty, how have you perceived these changes yourself as a researcher in the assessment practices, such as CV blind review of grant applications, getting rid of the H-index? How has that been for you as a researcher?
It's been really interesting. So back in 2019, the different funding institutions and also Dutch research institutions wrote this position paper that was called Room for Everyone's Talent. And they advocated that we, as Elisabeth very nicely captured, we have to steer towards a new system, one that's based on quality over quantity, where we want to stimulate open science, we want to also balance individual rewards versus team rewards, we want to stimulate leadership, but also diversify career paths. And as part of that, I think back when I did my first applications for the national funder, we had to work with the narrative CV format. And I remember personally thinking, oh, this is very exciting, and I'll finally have the chance to really show myself as I am. And then when actually having to do it, it was very daunting. You basically get a carte blanche, and I think I, like many scientists, were also trained to be professionally humble, right? And there was a way in which, in the old system, you could hide behind some of the indicators. So it was not about you saying, I am the best. It was saying, provided by these objective indicators, I am in the top 1% of my profession. So now having to all of a sudden craft my own narrative, I frankly remember not really knowing what that meant and what I had to do, despite thinking as a professional, this is what we should be doing. And I think, fast forward to now, so we've been in this recognition and rewards movement for 5 years. Now every Dutch institution also has a recognition and rewards committee, and it's up to them to now really craft these different job profiles where people can excel on either research or teaching or impact or leadership or, as Spranger was already alluding to, patient care. And what I hear, at least through the grapevine, is that really thinking hard about what are the concrete quality indicators for each of these different career tracks, that's a challenge we're still struggling with. So I think we're making headway, and our institutions are pulling out of rankings, and they're doing rather radical moves, with Utrecht being one of the front runners. But to really find the system on the ground is still more challenging, and in particularly when it comes to educating the new researchers and the early career researchers who are just coming on the market. There's not this big portfolio of successful applications that you can be inspired by. That's all of a sudden a very limited portfolio. So I'm a massive fan, but I know through my own experience too, it's harder than you think.
I think that's very valuable input. Thanks a lot for that. My next question goes right next to you, to Julian. You've secured a tenure-track professor position at the Technical University of Berlin. You're serving as a departmental chair there, and you're leading a team at the Fraunhofer focused on applied science with strong industry connections. From your perspective, what do you think of the current assessment system? Perhaps you can comment on both within Germany and, as you know it, beyond at the broader European level. Do you think we're prioritizing the right criteria for selecting scientists who can address the challenges of our time?
Jess, thank you so much for having me. It's my great pleasure, and I'm absolutely delighted being here. And I'm with Fraunhofer and TU Berlin since 2010, so I'm in the scientific ecosystem almost for 14 years. And what I can say about the tenure track program, it's an absolutely impressive program. It's absolutely unique, and it guarantees a lot of good options for qualification. So qualify yourself from W1 level to W3 level. This program guarantees an absolutely great path, and I received a lot of good support and great support from my mentor, Professor Ullmann, and also from the university. And it's an absolutely amazing opportunity. But just as like always in life, it's a question of balance, I guess. And yeah, we should make sure it's absolutely important to make sure that we have a lot of W3 chairs in the future as well, because we want to have highly qualified staff from the industry, well experienced and so on. That's these guys we want to have at the university, and not only W1 professors. So it's a question of balance, I guess.
And could you just explain for those not familiar with the German system, the W1 and the W3, and how that corresponds elsewhere?
Yeah, so W1 means they have a lower qualification in terms of publications, in terms of industrial experience and so on, and W3, yeah, is a different level of qualification. Like
corresponding to a full professor, and maybe a W2 would be an associate professor in other settings, and W1 assistant professor, is that about right?
Yeah, I
okay.
guess.
Great, thanks a lot. And I want to open it up also to Elisabeth over here. Elisabeth, Professor Herrmann, you're the chair of the tenure track board at the Humboldt-University here in Berlin, but you also have insights into the British evaluation system through your role as the professor and chair of German studies at Warwick University in the UK. And I wonder how you perceive, wearing these different hats and in your different roles, the German system's progress, specifically in terms of research assessment reform so far, and perhaps what the biggest challenges are in the coming years. It's a big question.
It is a big question. It's actually two questions. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak on this panel. It's a very interesting perspective coming with two hats, my British hat and my insight into the German system as well, and serving as the chair of the tenure board. And I think I will be speaking more as the chair of the tenure board, or my experience as the chair of the tenure board at the Humboldt-University here. And that fits quite nicely with what Julian said. I think one of the biggest benefits, or the biggest improvement with research assessment in Germany, is the implementation of the tenure track system, and has been, because it offers young researchers the opportunity to plan their career, and it provides a transparency on the criteria which they will be assessed on at the end of their probation period. And that speaks to Tamarinde, what you mentioned. It's very hard to know what to expect. That can be really, really daunting. So the tenure track system, now introduced in Germany and implemented in Germany, provides much more certainty, much more predictability, and that has an impact, and Elisabeth, I think you mentioned that as well, on both the environment in which researchers do their research, and how they feel about it, and how secure they feel, how much certainty there is, so that they can actually focus on their research and are not worried about, how I need to write the next funding application, or the next postdoc funding application, the next job application. So I think that's a huge improvement. And also, Joachim, you mentioned the mobility aspect. I think that's a very great asset for Germany as well, introducing the tenure track system, because it opens up for international researchers to apply for German posts, because now the system is more compatible, I would say. The tenure track position at the Humboldt-University and at the Charité, I think it will be the same and as will be in other German universities. The position is based on a individual performance agreement. So the researcher or the tenure track professor knows right from the beginning what they will be expected to achieve. And I think this is really helpful. And there's 5 different categories that will be looked at. Research is the first one, and I think the biggest one: academic teaching, administration, PhD supervision, and postdoc mentoring, as well as skill development in HR and personnel management. Research is really important here, and how research is assessed. And I think the German system has made improvements a lot in this way, because in the tenure track agreement, it's not just the whole publication list that will be looked at, but what is actually reviewed is 5 publications selected by the tenure professor themselves. And so they have an impact on what will be looked at, and very closely looked at. And this is important. We still are struggling with indexes, impact, journal impact. That's what we see in the external reviews and everything. So it still plays a big role, and I think changes need to be made there, but lots of improvements has been made. To the second part of your question, what are the biggest challenges over the next 5 years for the German system? I would say internal promotion at your universities. There's still no continuing track beyond and after the tenure track period. It's the only option a researcher or a professor at the university has to be promoted within their own institution is that they receive a job offer from another university at a higher rank, and then they can negotiate at their home institution. Very difficult to understand from a UK perspective. And I think this is the biggest challenge to tackle over the coming years. I don't know if my time is up.
That was perfect. Thank you very much. So I actually, before we get into the discussion, have one more panelist to invite up to our stage today. Unfortunately, Dr. Miriam Kipp could not be here with us today, so we have only one additional panelist. Fills out the chair quite nicely. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Gauch, Stephan Gauch, as an expert in bibliometrics, you've researched the performative effects of bibliometric indicators in the scientific system, and we've heard a few metrics dropped already on the panel here today. I was wondering if you could tell us more about how these indicators, based on your work, influence behavior within scientific organizations. And there's a lot of talk about new metrics that might better capture things like scientific and societal value, but what challenges come up when trying to develop such new metrics, I wonder?
Yeah, thank you very much. I made notes because I listened to everyone. So I think I want to start with a distinction because I think there's two different things at play, and I want to label them as regimes. So there is, on the one hand, we have been talking about manifestos, guidelines, all these kind of things. Those are usually there to maximize adequate behavior. To point at something and say, oh, well, that's done very nicely. Indicators work differently. Indicators have a notion that is not so much oriented towards discipline, maximizing adequate behavior, but upon selection, on control. So if we talk about indicators, it's more about sorting, selecting, categorizing. So the other category tells us a lot about that. And these two regimes, like on the one hand, control, categorization, that is the domain where metrics come from, and these disciplinary regimes, they interact in a funny way. And they interact in a funny way that if you, for instance, take these measures of control and use them to incentivize people, suddenly, if that goes on for a long time, suddenly the means of selection becomes a means of proof. And the means of proof is, oh, the system is running well because we now see that everything is maximized if we start to incentivize people. And from that, regarding how indicators influence behavior, I would like to make a little bit, because I've heard about tenure track and everything, so I would basically want to focus on selection. And I would like to start with a promise. The initial promise of indicators back in the day was to end nepotism. Okay, so the idea was, there's a lot of things going on. It's a little bit shady, maybe. I like that person, so maybe get that one promoted. And that the indicators were a promise that this should change in the long run. So it was a promise to end nepotism, and it's seductive in these kinds of procedures. It's seductive in two ways. It's on the one hand, it's seductive because it's a measurement, it's a scientific thing in a way. And on the other hand, it allows these regimes of control to work very well. Okay, so categorization, selecting, sorting, making a threshold, ticking some boxes, putting somebody in, putting somebody out. So these are the two things that drive that. Okay, so indicators make these things rather easy. It's like lean back evaluation, so you don't have to lean forward. So that's why I like that comment a moment ago. So the lean forward way is reading through stuff. The leaning back way is to have a table and then sort it and then say, okay, let's take the top three. So challenges. I think, and that might be controversial in a way. I see that if on the level of organization, because you mentioned organization, I see that as an active process. It's not a passive process. Active process also means not waiting for others to do that work. Because, speaking as a scientometrician, there has been 20 years of improving these measures, and impact factor is just one, Hirsch index is just one. But sometimes they might not fit. And so the active part of the process is to have the idea of putting these things together, which might, in the end, be a double-edged sword. It might be a double-edged sword because these notions of having more metrics are not subtractive. That's not a subtractive activity, that's an additive activity. Okay, there's more things, more goals to aspire to. And that leads us to the things, profiling, having a lot of things to choose from, and that is the part that is probably on the level of the organization one thing that is hard to grasp, okay? So it's not something to wait for and then waiting for the better metrics to flood in and then use them. The other thing is, when is the vertical, like rankings, somebody's at the top and somebody's at the bottom, when is that informative and for what means is that informative? For that process that you described, it's not really informative. On large scale, it might be informative for some people, but on the means of selection, like I said, I want to focus on that, it might be only informative in a way to select early. And that is a thing that does not enable you to get to know the candidates better, which is the prime thing that you want to do in the end of the day. So, when to use metrics, in what order, how they fit into the process, that's another thing that might be a challenge. And maybe finally, sometimes I hear the argument being made that, oh, let's make that a bottom-up activity, which sounds good if you hear it the first time, but what about fields where the ideas of these metrics is very, very deeply ingrained? I don't want to drop any field, it's not necessary, everyone knows what I'm talking about. But there are disciplines that are armored to Hirsch indices and GIFs. So if that is an established thing, how do you get that new thing in? Thomas Kuhn usually probably would say, yeah, well, paradigms die with people. That might be a little bit harsh, but that the inclusiveness, it's not a guarantee to arrive at something different, okay? So this is kind of activity that might be problematic. And maybe finally, to round it up, if we have this notion that we want to talk about profiles, so there's a specific profile for research administration, there's a specific profile for a researcher, for somebody who teaches more than researching. Where is the place to decide that? Is that place the organization? So we have a large selection of indicators and the organization selects from that. Is it professional associations? Is it even higher than that? But because all of this will replicate, it's not changing the basic thinking behind that. More indicators doesn't mean different kind of decisions because the taste has to be there. There has to be a taste for this kind of diversity to manifest in these types of profiles. So where that place to decide is, I honestly am not sure about it, but I think the organization would be a starting point.
Thank you for that, Stephan. So I'd like to actually take it over to Elisabeth, if I may. I think that last point about organizations and who are the deciders and what is used fits neatly into CoARA's mission. Would you like to comment on that point or something else you heard in the panel?
Yes, lots of really interesting inputs, and I was scribbling down notes. That last point, I think, is probably one that I would scratch my head about a little bit because I think you're right. I think who should be deciding. I think the locus of decision does need to be within the community, though, and I think that's one of the challenges that we have with existing publication metrics is that they are decided elsewhere. They're decided by commercial providers who have become formerly publishers, often now kind of data analytics companies who are kind of feeding us with metrics and indicators that we kind of lazily use in order to kind of make decisions for us. And I think that's something we need to draw back from and independently as a community, and involving all of those bodies, so the funders, organisations, learning societies. We've all got a perspective, a really helpful view as to what the new paradigm might be and how it might look. And it's those conversations, I guess, that CoARA is kind of enabling through its working groups, through its national chapters, to ensure that we as a community take ownership over what and how our researchers are assessed.
Thanks a lot. I'm curious to hear, Joachim Spranger, when you've heard these inputs also about the tenure track procedures and some of these changing metrics and researchers fearing essentially, or that there's this maybe concern that, how do I define myself? What will be looked at? What will be important in the future? What kind of advice maybe would you give researchers at the Charité, or maybe from abroad who might want to come to the Charité, who are looking to beef up their profile and be good applicants for these procedures?
Well, first of all, I think one of the improvements we see is that we are discussing these questions. We didn't do that some years ago, and I think that is very positive. One risk I do see is that we criticize the matrices, but we have no good answer yet what is better than that. And the answer I hear is, yes, we do qualitative peer review of the papers and things like that, but there is a high subjectivity to that. And Stephan called that nepotism, and that is true if you think, you need to consider at a university we have many professorships, many tenure track procedures, and if you have just two you're looking at, it's easy to go into to dive deep and make a very excellent qualitative assessment. If you have hundreds of professorships per year, it's much more difficult. So I think what we at the end need is a kind of mixture, probably. And what I feel is we also need individual solutions. So I would like to give one example from the Charité. We have also new disciplines. We have nursing science in the Dutch. That is in the Dutch system. I think that is very established. Here in Germany, this is very novel, and these nurses, they cannot compete with, for example, medical researchers. And how do we consider that? And we need specific solutions for this. And this is something I think we do not have good solutions. So to answer your question, what would I recommend? I would recommend, to be honest, to still look at established indices. I think it would be a mistake for an individual researcher to think he can just rely on novel issues. As an institution, we clearly have to move forward and think what good answers might be. But yet, I need to say, even in this panel round, and there are many experts apparently, I did not hear an answer of what really the best way is. I would be very interested to hear a little bit more about the Netherlands, what the system change brought in terms of really changing quality of research. So can you measure output? You mentioned mortality. Can you measure that? Do you see a difference? These would be things I would be really interested in.
Yeah, would you mind actually, Tamarinde, sharing a bit from what you've seen and felt so far?
Yeah, I think it was in particular, so I think, as you from CoARA probably know much better than I do, those kind of systemic changes are also met with resistance, right? You were already referring to some fields who were sort of grown up and got attached to particular metrics that also worked very well for them. What we, I think, have seen is, first of all, that not the whole system collapsed. And that was a little bit that people were in the back of their minds also afraid of. Our big two national funders are still handing out grants. What I think is a bit of an empirical question that's still under investigation is, do we now, for example, give these big individual competitive grants that are basically the taxpayer money that goes to you because you are the most brilliant scientist of the next generation, you have this great idea. Do we now give these grants to different kinds of people? Because part of the presumption, of course, is, okay, we've changed our whole assessment frame, then maybe we now filter out new individuals, right? Because you were also talking about we have a leaking pipeline, we might be losing people. And this is still something that's under investigation. I know our national funder is very much interested in that kind of data, and they're comparing it. And so far, at least, there hasn't been this big push against these national funder policies. And I think we're slowly also seeing the adoption of, okay, apparently this is how the system works. And so far, it hasn't selected frank idiots. And that's a bit of a relief to the community, I think. But I think that the coming years are really going to show that the proof's going to be in the pudding. I just wanted to also echo, I think the question on who decides what your profile's going to be is a really, really big one. I remember when I was preparing my individual funding applications, I didn't feel I have to consult about that with anyone. Maybe, some of my mentors, as you were also referring to, but that becomes a very tricky question, right? Maybe you're very good at patient care, but maybe you want to excel in research. What do we then do, right? Do we, as an organization, because you were saying maybe we should move the onus to the organization, are we going to say, you're just better suited for something else? How does that fit with academic freedom? Those are still things that really puzzle me.
Thanks a lot. I would also like to hear Julian's thoughts on that specific matter, if you'd like to weigh in. From the German perspective, let's say, to be more specific. So I would wonder, how do you feel about potentially these shifting incentives or shifting things that we're recognizing and rewarding? How would those, let's say, who are partway or further along the process perceive that? And do you also agree that this transparency is important for the individuals who are applying, let's say?
Yeah, the transparency is important, of course. And I guess you have the freedom to find your own path. And it's a question of yourself how to proceed further and which direction you would like to go. Even if you're good at one thing or at the thing, you can also extend this, or you can also decide to go on a different path. Yeah.
And you mentioned also innovation, things like patents. What has been your experience there, or working also together with the industry? Is that something that academia smiles upon? Have you seen that be acknowledged formally in procedures, or is that something that you have to sort of justify on top and hope that people notice in your profile?
No, especially in the academic field, patents are very important. And these have, coming back to criteria, these have same counts, for example, like a third-party funding application. Yeah, that's the thing at the university, and it's a great opportunity, especially at the university, to hand in patents and to hold patents and to extend these patents also, and after your university life, when it comes to researchers, for example.
Okay. And just before we open up for those audience question, Elisabeth, I'd like to give you one more opportunity to respond to whichever of these points raised you find most interesting.
Very shortly, maybe. I think I would agree that we need to look at a combination. And it's still some valuable things we have had in the past, and we don't want to lose them. And it's good to hear from Tamarinde that the system didn't collapse, and it didn't change or overturn everything completely. So there are some good things, and I think what changes can and a reform can bring is what you mentioned, Julian, is diversity. That we look at contributions, research contributions that have been overlooked in the past, and that researchers can develop in different kinds of way, and not just what we have in our mind as evaluators.
Thank you very much. So maybe at this time, if we could see, does anyone in our live audience have a question they'd like to ask? Just raise your hand nice and high, and we will bring the microphone over to you. See one there. Just maybe briefly state who you are, and then ask your question to our panel.
Well, I'm from the Netherlands, and I have a PhD in law, and I studied physics in the distant past. My question is that universities are also run, at least in the Netherlands, as a business to provide education to preferably as many students as possible, and they do sometimes commercial research. So there is academic freedom and business doesn't combine very well, but in practice, they like to have many students, and they like to do commercial research. I would consider that a danger, but I would value your opinion. Or aren't you? The things I heard so far are just about research and doing good research, but providing education to as many students as possible is another objective. Does it ring a bell for you?
Perhaps could I give that one to you, Joachim?
Sure. I mean, this is a topic about assessment of research. I think this is why we're discussing that. If we talk about, for example, about tenure track, then of course in the evaluation criteria we also have educational aspects and aspects of teaching. And they are also very important for the evaluation of the tenure track candidates. Whether we should use or integrate that in our system, I'm not sure. I personally, so in the system of performance-dependent resource allocation, and I'm not sure actually. I think it's important to really have separate resource allocation systems for that. And that means here in Germany, education is not a business as you call it. It's part of our academic work and task and goal. And I would think we need systems to reward both, but separately. I think it's difficult to mix that up. But you clearly make a point, both is important.
Thanks for that question. I would like to go to one more audience question before we go to the online questions. Please.
Yeah, thanks, Uli Diernagel, Quest Center. I think Tamarinde brought up a very critical and important question, that is, do we select different candidates with these new criteria? The question I have is, how can we find out? Because I think a lot of the old criteria are still in the heads of those that sit on the committees. And so they have these new criteria, but do we really know whether they are applying them? My suspicion, at least in the environment I work with, they don't.
Maybe I can give this to actually both Elisabeths, one after the other, if I may. Would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think we certainly do need evidence to support the differences that these sorts of new systems are actually making. That's one of the points I was making in my intervention, really. And it's going to be a long game, because obviously we can perhaps look at the short-term impacts. You know, did a different set of candidates get selected? How do we actually know whether they were different? But in the long term, what impact will that have on science if this group are kind of succeeding and this group aren't? So there's those sorts of questions. But it is a little bit early to say. We have obviously got the research community, the meta-science community, kind of growing in size and number and in funding at the same time as these kind of new expectations around research assessment are coming to the fore. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity for the research community to inform and evaluate the changes that we are making here. But just anecdotally, I would say that I often speak at events like this, and I was at an event in Portugal recently when someone stood up and said that they were a victim of CoARA, because they hadn't received funding in a recent funding call, which had been the criteria for which had changed in line with CoARA, and they felt that they had lost out as a result. And of course, I was sympathetic towards him, but also kind of relieved, because I thought, well, that is the point. If we are changing the criteria, right, different sets of people, a broader diversity, hopefully, of skills that we need to actually do research will get to succeed and get to shine and be rewarded for that.
And Elisabeth, would you like to respond directly? Sure.
Just very briefly, I think it's important to mention, it's not important, it's a first step whether we have other researchers, but the important point is really whether we improve the science. You mentioned that, and that is really the long-term goal, and that has to be shown, to be honest.
So I want to ask Elisabeth, in relation directly to that question, in the tenure track board, can the members presented with new criteria who are briefed on new ways of evaluating, can they shut off these old voices in their head that are calling back these old ways of assessment? What do you think to that point?
Well, I think it is difficult to change people's mind, but there are many people that are open, many researchers that are very open to that. And I think the really big advantage with CoARA and these initiatives is that they tackle subjectivity. We need to do something about subjectivity and the transparency that comes with it. That's the most important thing. It won't be easy to change people's mind, and maybe we don't have to do it in all respects. I mean, what I can see in the UK, what will be really difficult is to change people's minds in terms of a university ranking. That plays a huge role in the UK and in the US, and there are people who mind about it, and that's the students' parents who send their their children to university and pay a lot of money for it. They do care about university ranking. I see that as a very difficult point to address, but it's worth it.
Thank you. Could we get one of the Q&A questions? Is someone back there with a mic, or should I pick one? I can also pick one. Ulrika, you have one picked out?
Yeah, I have one.
That'd be great.
Online question. How should evaluation of teaching be integral to this evaluation process? We tend to only focus on research, which is frustrating.
Okay, we heard a little bit about the teaching in the previous question. Would you like to add something, Tamarinde?
I can maybe add two things from the way that we do this in the Netherlands, and also from some recent shifts we made. What used to be the primary criterion was student evaluations, and this was terrible. It went in particular very, very harshly against some groups. So women overall were structurally undervalued, as well as people from different communities that were typically demarcated as minorities. They would get significantly lower ratings from students. So we have abolished that as a sort of main criterion for what's the quality of your teaching. It's still taken into account, and it's used as a way to signal, are there particular problems with this course? Could this be improved? Is there something going on? And there's different committees monitoring that. But it's no longer just because they don't like the way you talk, you don't get internally promoted. And it really worked that way in the past. And it was something that was very daunting, especially for teachers who were just starting. Part of what we do now is looking at whether people possess genuine teaching qualifications. We also do sort of peer assessment. And I think there's part of a way in which people sit into some of your courses and also look at the quality of the kind of exams that you develop. And those are definitely, again, more time and labor intensive measures, but I do think they're better measures than just asking for a thumbs up.
Do we have time for one final question before we close things?
Should I?
Yes, please.
Okay. How do we make sure that our evaluation reforms don't create new looping effects or vicious circles based on a metriization of virtue signaling?
That's a great question. Stephan, would you like to answer?
You don't. The short answer for this is, because we're pressed for time, that every time you try to account for a new fairness, you will produce a different kind of unfairness. That is very much due to the nature how these, as I said, these metrics work. Metrics don't work to highlight individuals. Metrics work to situate individuals into some kind of mass and try to take them out. So in the long run, valuing one more aspect will either produce more work for people, so people have to do more things. If that is meant with the vicious cycle, maybe that might be true. But the overall answer is that if you install a metric, for instance, if you put a benefit on cooperation, and you, on the other hand, tell people, oh, there's so many people, so many authors and publications, so we would like to count that differently. So if there's 2 people, everyone gets half a paper on their account rather than 1, which is a thing that is being done. So these things are not in balance. So one might produce an impact or well, deduct some points on one dimension because you made another dimension stronger. So there is no...
It's a trade-off.
It's a trade-off. That's the shortest answer.
Well, Thank you very much. I just, for the sake of time, I just want to point you to one final poll, just to see what you feel after this conversation, and we could sit here, I'm sure, for another 2 hours and find lots of things to talk about. We're wondering what, in one word, difficult task, you would consider the most important aspect in evaluating researchers. We'd be curious to hear your thoughts. But I would like to say, wrapping up what we've heard here today, and I think this echoes something Joachim said earlier, we're talking about these things. This panel is happening. This is not something that I was hearing talked much about in Berlin when I started my scientific career. And even though we may not have all of the answers yet, I really appreciate that each of you in your different roles and wearing your different hats are thinking about these things, both in terms of implementation, but also from the side of the scientists, from policymakers, researchers, decision makers, and so on, and all of you here with us today. I think that means a lot, and together we can move the needle forward and hopefully do good quality science, which is, I think, what we're all interested in. So many thanks for everyone joining us here today. Can we put up that poll? Yeah, we see a lot of nice words. Transparency is a big one. Integrity, relevance, quality. Yes, important things that we would like to see when we are evaluating researchers and which researchers we should keep around in academia, what things we should reward, recognize, and incentivize. I think it's a nice summary. And I guess finally, I'd like to just thank everyone for being here today, panelists, audience, thank our organizers, the tech team, specifically the Berlin University Alliance, the Quest Center, and also the Einstein Foundation. And there's also another event coming up on November 5th from the Einstein Foundation. That will get posted up here, so you can follow up that QR code to talk more about early career, specifically finalists for the Einstein Foundation Award. That should be very interesting. So please do tune in for that if you have the time. Thanks for being here today, and wish you a lovely afternoon. Many thanks.